IVM.
How would you like to be rewarded for paying your credit card bills on time? Cred gives you the chance to be part of an exclusive club of highly trustworthy individuals where you get cashback and other rewards for being good. Now that's a great policy. So don't miss out. Just download Cred and be part of the club.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
I am Amira Rao, and I am joined by Aditya Parikh. The headlines for the past few weeks have been dominated by one of the longest-running wars of attrition, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. However, we will not be talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict, but a similarly long-running conflict in Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland saw riots last month and a few bomb threats against the Northern Ireland Police Service and political fallout over the post-Brexit trade deal. To discuss, I have with me Aditya. So welcome, Aditya.
Thanks, Amira. It's great to be back on the show.
So the first question I want to ask you is, can you give us a short rundown of the Northern Ireland conflict and the political contention over there?
Well, to start with, I think it's important to say that the conflict is largely a sectarian and political struggle on two different levels. One is between Catholics and Protestants that goes back centuries, and Republicans and loyalists/unionists who want to remain with the United Kingdom. So basically, people want Northern Ireland to be a part of the United Kingdom versus people who want it to be a part of the Irish Republic, the Irish Free State. So the Irish Republican struggle goes back to early 20th century, and the Irish nationalist struggle goes back to 17th century, at least the history that I've read. So it really is about how far back do you draw the line for your study and what atrocities do you consider to be a part of the events in reaction to which events came to be. So it's not really a cut and dry black and white answer. It's a lot of shades of gray. So is it Oliver Cromwell's plantations that usurped land in the 1650s, or the potato famine in 1840s? Or the Home Rule League's demands in the 1870s, or the Easter Uprising in 1916? Well, I personally study the conflict from the Irish War of Independence, which was 1919 to 1922 today. So the various groups that have called themselves the Irish Republican Army, it's not really a monolith as much as people would like you to believe. And Sinn Féin, the primary political party which embodies the spirit of Irish nationalism and Irish republicanism. So it's seen as a political wing of the IRA. However, both of these entities have never been this monolith where no different voices have existed. They've had splinter groups, and they've had plenty of them. So the IRA in the Irish War of Independence, 1919 to 1922, that ended with the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the creation of the Free Irish State, which is today's Ireland, as we know it, Republic of Ireland. While the Protestant dominated at the time, Northern Ireland remained in the UK. Today, if you talk about the demographics in Northern Ireland, it's about 45% Catholic and 48% Protestant. This is data according to 2011 census of the Northern Ireland. And I think the populations have shifted through history. And I think today, there really isn't the same kind of contention on this issue, that it's equally divided. So we're talking about the IRA. So the IRA is split between anti-treaty and pro-treaty IRA in 1922. So the pro-treaty folks wanted to be with the Republic of Ireland, and they were recognized as the armed forces of the Ireland post-treaty. And today's armed forces of the Irish Republic are basically the descendants of the IRA. of those times. And the anti-treaty folks became the enemies of both Ireland and UK because they didn't recognize either the Northern Ireland that was carved out in that treaty and the Irish Free State. They recognized neither's authority, neither the Crown in UK or the Free Irish State, the Irish Republic. So the IRA in general was fighting a war against the British Empire, which championed the cause of capitalism and imperialism in its own way. So it stood kind of in contrast in early 20th century to socialism and communism. So in late 19th to early 20th century, that socialist voice was something that appealed to certain elements in the IRA and the Sinn Féin of the time. So I think the Irish Republican movement did definitely have some sort of inkling towards socialism. So it's really to say it's no surprise that they always had some sympathy for the socialist ideals. So even going further, then around 1969, the Cold War's political impact splintered the Marxist-Leninists backed by Soviets into the official IRA or the National Liberation Front. So there was this meeting held, and at the time there was to be a vote in the IRA's Army Council and their whole structure. And at the time, these two groups emerged, where one was taking the more socialist approach, being more on the side of the Reds. And then there was this faction which was pretty much traditionalist. So the elements that were irked by Moscow's interference, kind of its direct impact on the Republican cause, they were irked by it, and the hardline left ideology was something that the official IRA championed, but the provisional IRA, which also splintered at this point, they were more traditionalist. So the provisionals are really the group that is mostly identified with the Troubles. They were involved with the worst bloodshed in the Troubles, as the unrest in Northern Ireland is commonly associated with. So the difference is, though, in the grand scheme of things, at their peak, the provisionals had like 10,000 members plus, according to Martin McGuinness, who was an IRA man at the time and later became the first deputy minister of Northern Ireland. And he died very recently. So the provisionals used to call them, probably never went over 2,000 members. Another reason for this split was the policy of abstentionism, where the Sinn Féin had elected MPs, but they refused to take their place in the House of Commons in Westminster. Despite winning elections, the provisionals wanted to continue this policy of abstentionism. More hardline left element did not. So the official IRA and provisional IRA had a split because of this. Then later in 1986, the provisionals also wanted to end abstentionism, but this caused another splinter, as you can see. That was the continuity IRA. Then when the actual peace process towards the fag end of the 20th century in the 1990s, so around that time, the peace that was signed on in 1997 during the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement, that has stood to this day, thankfully. And that came with a bit of caveats and based on the recommendations of a committee headed by Chris Patten. So he's the same person who was the last governor of Hong Kong before it was returned to China. So his committee recommended that there should be a reform of the police service of Northern Ireland. At the time, it used to be called the Royal Ulster Constabulary. So they had a pretty bad reputation among the Republicans, among the Catholics, that they used to be very sectarian. They used to be very anti-human rights, and they used to use just about brutal methods against any elements that that would be in the crossfire in this counterinsurgency operation. So this reform amounted to losing the crown insignia and cap badges, etc. And they had to recruit equally from Catholics and Protestants. And since then, in 2001, if I recall correctly, the Royal Ulster Constabulary was superseded by the Northern Ireland Police Service. So the name has changed, the cap badges have gone, and things have been relatively peaceful compared to the troubles. So, the splintering of the IRA has not stopped. Guess what? People who were not in agreement with the peace process in the 1990s, another splinter, Real IRA, came up, mainstream IRA, and Real IRA, I think, also merged very recently, this decade, I think. I mean, the 2000s. And since then, recently, there have been riots in the past few months. In Northern Ireland, there have been small bomb threats against the police service. But since then, it's been just a lot of drawn graffiti and marches down squares and symbolic gestures, that sort of a thing.
So, what was Margaret Thatcher's initial response to the Provisional IRA's actions?
So, Margaret Thatcher is seen as this once-in-a-lifetime Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, that she's often referred to as the Iron Lady. And believe me, she was everything that the popular culture paints her as. And unsurprisingly, Margaret Thatcher used to be very overly intolerant of the Provisional IRA's terror during her time in office. So she narrowly escaped an assassination attempt on her life, at least on one occasion I can recall. And notably, at around the same time, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who we know very well in India, lost his life to an IRA bombing. I think one notable thing that I can remember from the recent literature that I've been reading is that she got Sir Maurice Oldfield, who used to be a senior spy handler in Britain's employ. So he was sent to Northern Ireland to head the counterinsurgency intelligence efforts. So he created a system that was, even after his departure due to a personal scandal, served as the basis for decades in the future until the peace process was concluded, and possibly even now. That guided the British Army, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police service, the MI5, the Domestic Intelligence Service, and MI6, the Foreign Intelligence Service, Naval Intelligence, because the Royal Marines there, and all of those security apparatus members under an efficient system that was of Sir Maurice Oldfield's creation. Yeah, so during the late 70s, early 80s, so IRA didn't really just do violence. They also basically did everything across the spectrum. They were in politics via the Sinn Féin. They were doing peaceful marches as well because of some volunteers somewhere in that way. And they also had protests where IRA men and women who were apprehended by the British security forces, and when they were interned, when they were institutionalized, when they were incarcerated. So there was this blanket and no wash protest for recognition of their political status, that they are political prisoners. So Margaret Thatcher, her argument was, if you have murdered people, if you've bombed people, if you've carried out bombings of neighborhoods, of soldiers, their vehicles, you've killed dozens of people at a time. So how can you for capital crimes, be treated as political prisoners? There's no political murder. There's no political kidnapping. So, I mean, her argument in that sense is sound. But this was a protest where prisoners used to be, very difficult for the prison service of the Northern Ireland to handle. they refused to wear the clothes of the institution. They instead went naked and just took blankets from the institution. They, if I recall correctly, they used to say, "I refuse to wear the uniform of a prisoner, so of a criminal." So yeah. So it used to be. It used to be a lot of graphic stuff that really is a horrendous thing to remember.
So now I want to talk a little bit about the Soviets and the role of Soviet. So to what extent did the impact of the KGB and Soviet influence play a role in Northern Ireland and in the conflict as a whole?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So, I mean, Northern Ireland in the 70s was probably, that was the height of the bloodshed. That was the height of the troubles. And there was no sign of it letting. And at the time, the Soviet Union was also rising as this major power with its military at its peak, with the KGB's operations going just right. So there's a lot of details in the Mitrokhin archive. I highly recommend our listeners read both volumes. So you'd find a lot of details there. So at the time, Yuri Andropov, the legendary head honcho of the KGB, who also later became the leader of the Soviet Union in Reagan's time. So at the time, he initiated this program where the Soviet Union was supplying arms to the official IRA, the Marxist-Leninist splinter group that came out of the anti-treaty IRA. So they were also fighting with the traditionalist folks. So the impact of the KGB and the Soviet Union's intervention, I think, is limited to the official IRA, which never went to above 2,000 members or so. So in that sense, their impact was very limited.
Okay. So I want to go back to talking about the British now. And the question I want to ask you is, what kind of tactics did the British establishment choose to employ against IRA and the UVF?
So the UVF is the other side of the coin, to be quite honest. It's the loyalist militia, which was in reply to the Irish nationalist militias, the Irish Republican militias. So the tactic that the British establishment used against both of these sides was infiltration by, as one of the books that I'm reading right now, its title says, agents of influence. So these were intelligence agents who were used as infiltrators to collect intelligence on the groups that they were infiltrating and to feed them false information, to feed them information that would lead to the apprehension of these violent elements from either side's militias. So there were also direct military intervention. The SAS, the Special Air Service, the Special Forces of the United Kingdom, are quite famous in Northern Ireland. People often, jokingly say that if you deploy the SAS, Northern Ireland suddenly goes quiet. And there were Royal Marines, there were paratroopers of the British Army who, kind of got a very bad reputation because of Bloody Sunday in 1972, where a lot of people died, a lot of protesters died. So, the direct military intervention by the UK's forces is seen as one of the examples of excessive force being used.
So what lessons do you think the rest of the world, India in particular, learned from this conflict? And are there any specific features of the conflict that are notable?
Well, honestly, this is the most difficult question to answer because honestly, I haven't studied intelligence tactics a lot. So I think there's not very specific stuff there. I think the whole world watched very keenly. But the major difference for India, I think, is that the political situation is not similar in any of India's insurgency hit areas. India largely has three fronts of insurgency. It has dealt with post-independence. First is Jammu and Kashmir, the Northeast, and the Naxalites in central India. none of these three at the political situation level is 1:1 similar. So there is really, you'd have to jump through a lot of hoops, or you have to perform a lot of mental gymnastics to figure out similarities there. And for the rest of the world, I think it was a small theater of the Cold War because of the official IRA and the KGB. So one thing, although notably, is that air power was never used in Northern Ireland, as far as I can tell. And India's notable exception in this regard is Mizoram in 1966, during Indira Gandhi's time, where air power was in fact used in a counterinsurgency operation.
Yeah, but I think the most pressing question is now, what is the situation like today, and what is Northern Ireland's status post-Brexit?
So the biggest point of contention these days is the Irish Sea border and the Northern Irish Protocol post-Brexit. So, if you look at a map of Ireland and Northern Ireland, you would find that it's one island. And there's a sea between Scotland and the Irish island. So geopolitically, that's two different equations. So here, when the UK is no longer a part of the EU, so the customs regime, the trade, the open trade borders between EU states is something that the UK no longer enjoys. So Northern Ireland, being politically part of the UK and geographically a part of Ireland, is something that has emerged as a problem. So post-Brexit, the same customs regime as the EU is, as far as I can tell, in the sense that there are no checkposts, no hard border where checks for customs are carried out for goods going to Northern Ireland. Because a hard border was something that was a major point when this peace process was being discussed. So now the Republicans, as far as I can tell, are fine with this situation because, well, they always wanted it to be a free-flowing border where goods and people can pass through without any physical checks. There were no barricades, etc. There used to be, attacks against these barricades when they used to exist in the times of the Troubles. So now the discontent is on the side of the unionists and loyalists. So, because, well, in their opinion, the Republicans have gotten their way. So much so that recently the Unionist Party in power, the DUP, their first minister had to step down. She's Arlene Foster. So she had to step down because, well, the political situation was of this perception that she and her party didn't quite handle the post-Brexit scenario here pretty well. So last Friday, if I recall correctly, a new leader has been elected, Edwin Poots. So he's supposed to take a more hardline stance on this issue with the British Prime Minister and Westminster. So, the irony of the situation, however, is that the DUP did not want to a Brexit. They were not pro-Brexit. So now this contention is only because the Republicans have gotten their way.
So can you recommend some resources for our listeners to read up more about the conflict and know more about what has happened in the past, from history to present?
Yeah, sure. So I've been reading this author called Aaron Edwards, who's a lecturer at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. So I recommend two of his books. One, which I previously mentioned, Agents of Influence, which was published very recently, and UVF, Behind the Mask. So it'll give you both sides of the picture, why the militias did what they did, and what kind of people the British establishment used to infiltrate them. So it would give you a pretty good overview of the whole conflict and the insurgency situation there in the past. And for movies, I think Hunger 2008, which has Michael Fassbender, I think that would be the best resource to really see what exactly went down with the blanket and no wash protest. And believe me, it's graphic. Okay, and Bloody Sunday, 2002, which is about the British paratroopers and the excessive force part that I mentioned previously. So we'll link all of these in the description. And yeah, that's about it.
Well, thank you so much, Aditya, for this engaging and interesting conversation today, and also for the resources you have recommended. So, well, thank you for joining us on this episode.
Thank you, Amira.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, TheWholeTruthFoods.com, and Seat Tires. We really do appreciate the support. So the last year's been tough for all of us, and the second wave of COVID really hit us badly. To help those affected by the pandemic in India, the podcasting community has come together under the Pod for Change banner to raise funds through an exclusive NGO partner, Give India. Join IVM and Pod for Change as we look to make a positive impact in the life of those affected by COVID-19. You can go to tinyurl.com/podforchangeindia, and remember, somebody could really use the help. And now back to the promo. On the Simplified podcast, the gang explains the oxygen crisis happening in the country and tells us the various measures being taken to tackle it. On States of Anarchy, Hamsani Hariharan talks about how the geopolitical relationships shaped COVID response and the world order. As Indians, we're all familiar with acid reflux or heartburn, given the spicy food we consume. On The Habit Coach, Ashton has some simple solutions to counter that. Osama Moria explores the iconic neighborhood of Dadar and tells us its connection to outer space in Postcards from Nowhere. It was Dangle time on The Fighting Goat, as hosts Somesh and Arjun were joined by unbeaten MMA fighter and Commonwealth gold medalist Ritu Fogart. The traveling professor Siddharth Deshmukh shares examples of various innovations that came up during the COVID times and helped us deal with the situation. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
If you love cricket, listen up. The Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast is here for you. Hosted by DJ, Varun, and me, Ashwin, we bring a fun, fresh fan's point of view to talking all things cricket. Sometimes it's just the three of us, sometimes we have guests, including current and former international cricketers. For new episodes every week, check out the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast on the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts.